Saagar, let's take a look at how the Republicans have been truly divided about how they want to deal with all of this.
Yeah, this has been a fascinating kind of thing to watch. I'm curious to see how the Ukraine actual invasion will change things. But Trump can't help but Trump himself. So here's the statement that he put out. Go ahead and put this up there on the screen. Quote, Putin is playing Biden like a drum. It's not a pretty thing to watch. There's kind of been a really gross cheering on, Krystal, by a lot of segments of the American right that I've observed, in which they kind of relish seeing the world order crumble in order to own the libs and be like, see, this didn't happen under Trump. I mean, look, that's empirically true. But also, you know, I would say that in a time like this, you can criticize the president, fine, which I do plenty. But, you know, I think like actively cheering on
Putin is another
cheering
level.
on Putin. And again, I hate how much this sounds like some Russiagate stuff. Like you can parse it between like, okay, you know, what Trump says about Putin or what, you know, pursuing better relations with Russia, that's not treason or whatever. Also praising Putin in this, it's also not treason. I mean, it's kind of gross in terms of what you're doing. And that's where I would put the current domestic political situation. In terms of what he said specifically, it's frankly the most Trump response of all time. This was an interview he gave to Buck Sexton just a couple of days ago. Let's put it up there on the screen, which is, he says, quote, Putin is now saying it's independent, a large section of Ukraine. I said, quote, how smart is that? He's going to go in and be a peacekeeper. We could use that on our southern border. He's a guy who's very savvy. I think the funniest thing, Krystal, let's go ahead and put this next tear sheet up there on the screen, which kind of describes the big Republican dynamic, is that Trump apparently said that Ukraine is great, quote, from a real estate standpoint for Putin.
Jesus
so
Christ.
You know, he's always be closing. Classic. He's always thinking in that that mindset.
It really is disgraceful to, and he continued. I mean, it really is disgraceful to. It's not treason. It's not you know, impeachable or whatever. But it is disgraceful to be basically like praising and cheering on a guy who is just aggressively like initiating a war that is going to have massive consequences, especially for the Ukrainian people, result in death and destruction, but also for our own people here.
Part of the reason America First, now that it resonated with me, was because the seminal moment of my life was the belligerent U.S. invasion of Iraq. It was terrible. This is the same thing. We should be condemning it and feeling exactly the same way in our hatred of what is happening. That doesn't mean that you have to greenlight war. And I don't like Joe Biden either. You know, criticize him plenty here on the show. But to see all of it devolve into the culture war is actually deeply, deeply sad. That being said, on the actual specifics, there is a huge debate about what's happening on Capitol Hill. Throw that Politico tear sheet back up there on the screen, please. Because what they go into is that Republicans are descending into foreign policy factionalism over Russia and Ukraine. So Senator Josh Hawley had actually come out and basically taken similar position to what we had said, Krystal, saying, look, I don't think that Ukraine should be a part of NATO, recognizing the role of NATO expansion. He, you know, obviously departs from you. He said that he's like, look, I think this distracts from our number one geopolitical threat, which is China. I frankly agree with that. But what it is that the difference is that the other side of the GOP, and frankly, the more at least representative side from a pure what they believe in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, Tom Cotton, and all of that is kind of maximally neocon. I mean, we saw Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, you know, of course, an unhinged, unrestricted neocon who probably still apologizes for the war in Iraq, you know, floating some sort of U.S. must be involved, all of this. Mitch McConnell, similarly, remember that we saw that he praised Biden for sending troops abroad. I wouldn't be surprised if he said that we should greenlight some sort of, you know, Cold War or whatever in terms of Ukraine insurgency. So that is the big split. Obviously, Tucker Carlson on the side of Josh Hawley with the Republican base. It's hard to find a way that this all works because what people misunderstand. I just almost pulled a George W. Bush there.
Misunderestimate.
Yeah. What people don't seem to understand is that the Republican base does not have any theory of geopolitics. Mm-hmm. They love the culture war, and that's pretty much it. And so when I see people be like, the base wants to stay out, or the base wants to stay in, the base is with whatever Trump says. Mm-hmm. So I think it very much is the default to, look at Biden, he's a fool, all of that. I mean, if you were to come down to like U.S. invasion, everybody's probably against it. But people who are trying to say like this is what the base wants or not, I don't think people have any deep theories on it.
And I could see the base getting, if the conditions were correct, I could see the base being persuaded that we should be boots on the ground.
If Trump
we
did
should
that,
be
if Trump was like, he's like, Biden is weak and we should send troops, they would all be.
I mean, these are some
we
of
saw
the
this
same,
in Afghanistan.
These are some of the same people who cheered on war in Iraq for
Exactly.
a very long
That's
time.
right. That's
So,
right.
I mean, our public has
People are fickle.
People are fickle. People are very nationalistic, and they don't like to see us sort of like humiliated on the world stage, which this has to be seen as a global humiliation. And so, it is going to be very interesting to see how Trump responds, how the Republican Party responds. I think what I've seen so far, even among like the same individual, is something that is really incoherent. That's both sort of like, anti-intervention, but also Biden's not being strong enough. Yeah. But also, and I think the one consistent thread that you will hear from all of these people is it didn't happen under Trump. Without laying out like what he did that was different, that was better, or what Biden did that was wrong, just it didn't happen under Trump, so we got to go back to Trump. I think that'll be the most consistent.
That's going to be the answer
that you hear,
100%.
which isn't particularly thoughtful or nuanced, but that'll be the common thread.
I've been trying to think about why
that holds them all together.
Why not under Trump? I mean, here's the thing too. Trump departed from the Obama administration policy of arming the Ukrainians. People forget that. He's the one who sent them lethal aid. This was a huge debate in Washington in 2015.
Well, I mean, he got impeached over over the fact
and
that
then by not sending. So it's like
not sending, and then and he had a different position on Nord Stream.
Right.
I actually think it maybe is less about those individual decisions. And Trump was very hostile to NATO. And,
True.
I mean, I personally think that one thing, I have lots of issues with Trump. I think that one thing is the correct posture because.
No, I agree.
Why do we still have NATO? I mean, again, I think what we saw from the big Putin speech is that this was about a lot more than NATO. And even, sort of putting Ukraine completely off the table and having a different posture towards NATO probably wouldn't have been enough to stop this from happening. But in terms of the orientation of Trump and how that may have changed Putin's thinking or put him off till now, probably the animus towards NATO was maybe the biggest factor. That's just my guess.
I mean, look, I think NATO has a role. I don't think the expanded NATO was a good idea. That being said, that's what it is now, and there's no changing that.
Well,
and so,
I really thought it was interesting in Putin's speech when, who knows if this is true or not, but when he's talked about, I said to President Clinton, okay, well.
Right, in 1990.
Yeah, how about we're a member of NATO?
Right.
Basically just proving, like, you say this isn't about us anymore, but this feels like it's still about us.
No one can prove that. I read Clinton's biography. He never mentioned that. It's possible. Look, who knows, with Putin, whether he's lying or not.
And here's the other thing that we always have to keep in mind is, for us, we're looking at this, we're like, we don't even want Ukraine and NATO really.
Yeah,
so like, what are you so freaked out about? But in the same way that we perceive our adversaries' every move as aggressive and intentional, they of course view it the same way from our perspective.
Oh, look, and they have a long history going back over 1,000 years of being suspicious of the West, of being paranoid of any sort of
and rightfully
machinations.
So.
Not necessarily wrong.
Instances, yeah.
I think you're probably right. I think that the Trump posture towards NATO and being, very critical, rightfully, in my opinion, I long supported this, admonishing the Europeans for not fulfilling their defense obligations, frankly, was the correct posture. And I think it's also funny, in a way, this is a major vindication of that posture. You people, at the end of the day, primary deterrence was up to you. If there's a war on the European continent, you're the people on the front line, and yet you spend 1.5% of your GDP. You have way more of a threat against Russia than America ever will. And the Germans would always say, oh, you don't understand. It's a different situation now. I mean, look, who looks like an idiot now? And it's your country. You guys decide. You're only 1,000 miles away from Kiev or whatever. And I think that this is a vindication of that policy. But also you're correct, which is that his posture towards NATO very likely made it so that he didn't seem to be a real possibility. At the same time, I just don't know with Putin. I mean, it was never in the cards to let Ukraine into NATO, at least in the last year or so. Yeah, nothing changed on that front.
That's true. It could also be,
Look, he's old.
We're in a very weak position right now, coming out of the pandemic. You know, the nation is completely divided.
True.
We had an extraordinarily high death rate from COVID compared to the rest of the world. We can't agree on like the basics of society. You've got 80% of the public that says we're on the wrong track. Biden doesn't exactly, you know, score great marks when it comes to projecting strength, competence, capability, all of those things.
Yeah, very true.
And so it could just be, you know, partly kind of timing coming out of the pandemic and seeing this very weakened America and deciding part of which is Biden's fault, part of which is Trump's fault, and deciding that, you know, now's the time to strike. I don't think, listen, we'll never know. But we do know that the Republican line will be, it didn't happen under Trump, and they won't have to provide any specifics as to why.
Given what we're about to talk about, that's going to be a very compelling pitch in 2024.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it, you get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.